Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Traverse the Stars podcast, third season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. It's an amazing episode because David Pepose boards the mothership to discuss Space Ghost from Dynamite Entertainment. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, David. Thank you so much for the Traverse the Stars podcast.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk all things Space Ghost with you.
So my pleasure. Thank you for coming back to the show. I always like seeing a guest who returns.
Sure.
That sounds like there's not many, but there's a lot. But I want to appreciate you coming back on the show.
That was
So,
fun.
for those that don't know, the last time you were on the show, we talked Savage X-Men. Today, we're going to talk Space Ghost from Dynamite Entertainment. So, the thing about Space Ghost, how familiar were you with the character prior to writing the series?
Yeah. Well, I was introduced to Space Ghost in the way that a lot of people in my generation were, which is as Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And it wasn't until I was in college that I realized that there was like a whole history to Space Ghost that I wasn't aware of. It was my first internship in the industry. I was interning at DC Comics, and that's when I learned about Alex Toth. And learned sort of what a titan he was. I saw somebody just recently refer to him as the Jack Kirby of Hanna-Barbera, and I think that's like such a perfect way to describe him. But yeah, I learned then that like, oh, I learned about Alex Toth, and then I learned about Space Ghost, and I learned about Space Ghost being kind of like a spiritual successor to Adam West's Batman.
Hmm.
And learning about him is that he was an actual superhero who he actually fought, interstellar bad guys. And I around that time during my internship, I guess they there was either the trade lying around, or they had done a re-release of Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's Space
Hmm.
Ghost miniseries from 2005. And so I was reading all that, while I was interning and while I was learning about all these industry figures, and I was like, huh, that's a character that's like seems really underrated. Like that's a character with some really cool ingredients to him.
Hmm.
But between the amazing design and his almost Superman or level array of abilities with his power bands,
Hmm.
that give him powers over lasers and fire and ice and force fields, and his invisible belt that lets him turn invisible. And of course, he's got the Phantom Cruiser and his base on Ghost Planet. And then learning about that he didn't have just one, but three sidekicks. Jan and Jace and their pet monkey Blip. And I think even back then I was kind of like, huh, that's like a choice. That's like very specific. It's one thing to have somebody like Batman, where it's Batman and Robin. You
Hmm.
could tell a Batman story without Robin and it still feels organic. But I was like, three sidekicks, like, huh, that feels pointed. And then learning about his rogues gallery. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a rogues gallery like Batman or Spider-Man or the Flash. Like
Hmm.
it's Alex Toth. He's just throwing out fastball after fastball. And so that was sort of my thoughts on Space Ghost for a long time. And of course I'd catch the occasional episode on like Boomerang. And I sort of knew about it a little bit just like kind of through pop culture osmosis. And obviously what I had read in the Joe Kelly run. And so Dynamite reached out to me and said, "Hey, listen, like we just announced this deal with Warner Brothers Discovery. My editor Joe Ryban, he approached me at New York Comic Con, like they had just announced at the
Hmm.
show, and they said we are doing a Space Ghost book, and you've just worked on Punisher, you've just worked on Moon Knight City of the Dead. You would be our top choice for this book. Would you be
Hey.
interested? Would you have any ideas?" And immediately I was just like, yeah, like this is a character who has all the ingredients of an A-lister. He's like if Batman fought crime in the Star Wars universe. And the fact that like I could tell a story like this, and not only that Dynamite and Warner Brothers were so generous with the runway. They immediately said, like, how do you feel for a year to start? Do you think you could tell a story over the course of a year? And I had, at Marvel, had really been kind of drilled into me, particularly my Punisher miniseries. Everything's kind of trending towards done in one storytelling. You see how like Ryan North does it in Fantastic Four, Steve Orlando
Hmm.
does it in Scarlet Witch. And so I was like, yeah, you could tell like a really cool, like Batman the Long Halloween by way of Ultimate Spider-Man retelling of Space Ghost. And immediately I kind of saw this really cool through line of particularly because I remember the Joe Kelly run. And the Joe Kelly run, for those who haven't read it, came out right before Batman Begins. And you can see a lot of similarities. It was very similar in that zeitgeist.
Hmm.
And so I didn't want to tell like a straightforward superhero origin story because that story's already been told like 20 years ago. And I would rather not have to like compete on that field. But nobody's really ever told the story of how like Space Ghost and Jan and Jason Blip kind of became this unit and became this found family. And that became really the through line of this entire series, was giving Space Ghost sort of putting him through this gauntlet of every single iconic villain that's
Yeah.
been in the series, but also really digging into like the emotion of it all, the ongoing evolving dynamic between him and his sidekicks, and how they go from being these like orphaned rescues to becoming his trusted sidekicks, to becoming this found family in their own right. And so, yeah, it really is. It was a book that I was given so much runway to play around with, and it really checks all my boxes. It lets me kind of write every single thing that I would like to write, everything that comes to mind, while still never forgetting about like the emotional core behind it. So seeing how overwhelming the response has been to this book from the moment we announced it to the moment we're speaking, the book just came out 2 days ago,
Hmm.
and seeing how overwhelmingly positive the responses have been to this book, boy, it really it feels like a gift in a lot of
Well,
ways.
well, I was gonna say, just to point out, the book actually sold out at my comic book store, so I had to buy mine on digital. But
Oh
it
wow.
actually sold out at the store. So because I went up on literally yesterday. I was like, to get my copy, and they're like, it's gone. And I was like, well, you're gonna find it somewhere, hopefully, because I want it. And then like, nope, it's totally gone. So I was like, okay, well, Amazon digital for me.
Well, I am sorry. I'm sorry to hear that you didn't get your copy. Yeah, I know Dynamite was telling retailers, and I told retailers, and we were all like, "You got to order more than what you're ordering. I promise you're not ready for this." And yeah, they so hopefully you can still reorder some. But if not, well, tell Dynamite, and maybe they'll print a new run.
Well, hopefully they do reprint it. Now, the interesting about Space Ghost is that you have a few challenges that you definitely need to overcome for the new series. The
Yeah,
first one was that a lot of people do know him from Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which is a humorous kind of like tongue-in-cheek
sure.
series. But your take is definitely more serious. So you got to. So I was wondering, like, how did you choose to? Because it was not only was it serious, but you definitely made it the intention to make it a lot
Yeah.
more serious than what the TV show Coast to Coast is like. So, what steps did you make to make sure that it was taken as a serious character, not kind of like the goofy
Yeah.
guy?
Well, there are a couple reasons behind that. I mean, first and foremost, just that, when I was talking with our licensor with Warner Brothers Discovery, we're all pretty much in lockstep agreement that we wanted to bring Space Ghost back to his superhero roots. But on top of that, we're not even the first comic to do that. Like I said, Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti, they had I think a pretty gritty kind of run. I wouldn't really consider our book any grittier than like an average issue of Batman. And then you see things like Future Quest, where that was a serious superhero take. Future Quest Presents, which the first four issues were Space Ghost centric, and that was again drawn by Ariel Olivetti. You see him again in teaming up with Green Lantern in the Space Ghost Green Lantern one shot. So the thing is that like there is Space Ghost Coast to Coast, but also like every single comics appearance that he's ever had, with I think rare exception in like Cartoon Network Presents, they've all been serious superhero takes. But for me, I think the thing that was most exciting for me was just I've been promoting this book for like 2 months, and it was only until the book came out that I was like, oh, this is Ultimate Space Ghost. Like,
Hmm.
boom, that is exactly what this is, where it's brand new continuity, it's an easy jumping on point. But for me, I feel like it almost felt a little like counter programming, where yeah, like it's easy to say, oh, well, why don't we just do what somebody else did? Whether it's doing a perfect recreation of the 1966 show, or
Hmm.
doing a recreation of Coast to Coast. But I think Space Ghost, at least for me, having like kind of dug into the history of the character, he's always a product of his time. 1966, he comes out right on the heels of Adam West Batman, because everybody is trying to get a piece of that Adam West Batman
Yeah.
action. And if you couldn't license a superhero, you're going to make one of your own, and that is how Space Ghost comes into being. And so, of course, you can see so much shared DNA. It feels very much like a Silver Age camp kind of show.
Hmm.
And then Space Ghost, is in reruns for years. And then he comes back, 1981, Space Stars. It's right on the heels of Super Friends. It's
Hmm.
coming out as contemporary to Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends. You see it's part of the zeitgeist again. And then there's Coast to Coast. Where Coast to Coast, I think, is this perfect distillation of like the irony of the MTV generation, and that is just like riding the crest of that and defining like absurdist late night comedy for a generation.
Mm.
But then, like I said, Joe Kelly comes over with Ariel Olivetti. And even though that book predates Batman Begins, you wouldn't know it having read it. It feels very much in that zeitgeist. And so that was sort of my thinking was just like, it's the year 2024. How do we tell a Space Ghost story through that lens? Using modern storytelling techniques, but also taking these perfectly constructed bones that Alex Toth made for the character that have been kind of preserved in amber thanks to Coast to Coast. It's kept the Space Ghost name alive, but it hasn't dug into these characters and strip mined them in a way that so many other superhero properties have been.
Mm.
I feel like an archaeologist, where I get to kind of like chip away and sort of excavate these bones and be like, they are just as strong as they were in 1966.
Mm.
And I think that's the thing that I felt justified our approach is that comic book fans, we're a picky bunch. I don't have to tell you.
That's one word for it.
You
Go
know,
picky.
but it's one of those. So many of us are encyclopedic in our knowledge, and yet we want something new. We want to keep kind of
Right.
constantly reinventing the wheel. And Space Ghost feels like rare, unexplored territory in a genre that has been so thoroughly mined everywhere else.
Mm.
And so the fact that nobody has told a story in comics where you get to see Space Ghost fight the Council of Doom. Nobody has told a story where you get to watch him, hit villain after villain after villain. And then also, how does he meet Jan and Jace? No one's told that story in any great detail.
Mm.
And that sort of thing, like, really fires me up as a writer. And so I think that's what's been so exciting is seeing how many people have read our book. Yeah, we've had diehard fans who are like, wow, this feels like a love letter to 1966, but like recaptured in 2024.
Mm.
But the thing that's made me so excited is how many readers have picked up this book saying, I have no idea who Space Ghost is, or I only knew of him as Coast to Coast. And I just heard a review today that made me laugh where he was like, he starts it off with, does Space Ghost kick ass? And yes, yes, he does. And I'm so excited to show everybody why that is.
Because as I mentioned, like one of the other challenges with Space Ghost, I'm a hardcore comic book fan. I've been reading comic books for 35 years. I know
Sure.
the name Space Ghost. I definitely know what he looks like. But other than the name and some idea of him, I don't really have much of a concept to the character. And then
Yeah.
you had the fans who, as you mentioned, hardcore Space Ghost. They know the character. They know what their expectations are. You talk about it in a comic book by Joe, okay, it was Joe Kelly written in 2005, 20 years ago. So when you're thinking about your Space Ghost, there's so much kind of expectations, a little bit unknown aspects as well for that audience. Is it difficult? Was it difficult to kind of choose which pieces you want to take and which audiences you're most looking to either please or gain?
No, I mean, I think ultimately you just have to follow your heart, follow your instincts. And for me, I think the thing for Space Ghost, again, this is a show that in 1966, there are 5 minutes of pop. There's no continuity, there's no backstory,
Hmm.
which was so freeing for me. I mean, our licensing partners at Warner Brothers, they have been so supportive. They've been the best licensors I've ever worked with by a country mile, because they're just like, yeah, we know there's no backstory. Like, what do you think? What's the most dynamic and character driven way for you to do this? And so, like I said, like, sort of the ultimate Space Ghost kind of take. But yeah, I think, ultimately for me, Space Ghost, even the original series, I feel like the Council of Doom was really like a brilliant constellation. It was sort of this series that had no connectivity whatsoever, and then suddenly the last like few episodes, it's all connected at once.
Hmm.
And so for me, I was like, I knew, okay, we have to have these villains in there. Like these are iconic villains. In a series that doesn't have much in the way of expectations, that strikes me as an expectation that we will introduce those villains and we will bring them together. I think though, beyond that, I mean, somebody actually said to me recently, and I've been thinking about it for a while, is they said, I don't know what a Space Ghost series is supposed to be.
Hmm.
And, I think that's such an interesting question. And I think that's a question that I think has maybe caused a lot of angst in our business, both from the reader side of things and creator side of things, is that I don't necessarily think that these books are supposed to be anything other than what the creative team is trying to set out. And I think if you can engage the work on that level, you're going to be opening yourself up to so much more fun and exciting stuff. Yes, if you think that the book is supposed to be coast to coast, yeah, you probably won't like our book. But that said, like I also don't think it's that interesting to try to just redo what was done over the course of 11 seasons. Like that's their thing. Just in the same way that like I'm not going to try to recapture 1966. I'm looking forward. 2024 is where I'm looking, 25, And so yeah, I think for me it was just kind of feeling out all the various puzzle pieces, and just being like, okay, like for example, our first issue, Brack and Sisto, our villains in there. And the reason I wanted to start off with them was I felt like, oh, this feels like a thematic parallel of having Jan and Jace as our point of view characters. They're twins, brother, sister, having them fight against a pair of supervillains that are siblings felt like a good way to kind of start us off. Like that felt right to me. And so some of that is just like kind of feeling it out, like knowing that, for example, we're gonna have Zorak show up, but he's not showing up in like issue 2. Like we're gonna sort of make you wait a little bit for him to show up, because then when he does, you're gonna be like, oh, this guy's the guy that makes Space Ghost scared. Like we've gotten to know these characters a little bit more. Um, and so yeah, I think some of it's also just kind of following your heart and knowing that for me, this is I planned 12 issues in an annual. That was my original pitch for Dynamite, and knock on wood, I mean, based on the response of this first issue, I don't see that changing. But yeah, I think for me it was like we're doing a lot of done in one stories for this book. So we're able to hit a lot of these characters, and we're only sort of sparingly we're doing a couple of 2-parters and maybe a big 3-parter down the line. But otherwise, done in one. Every month you get a self-contained chapter, you get to meet a new villain. And so it was a lot of calculus of like, is this going to be a main villain? Is this going to be a villain that's like more of a cameo? Like, for example, the Lizard Slavers. Like they're going to show up for a little bit in an issue. Are they going to be like the main villain? No. But like knowing like, okay, we want to have Space Ghost fighting like an alleyway full of bad guys. Like there's a lot to pick and choose from. Or, Tanzit, for example, where I'm like, oh, that's a fun character, but like I don't watching those episodes with him, like I didn't have like a strong like sense of like something to glom onto like I would for Zorak or Brack or the Widow. So I'm like, okay, great. We have pirates who are hitting this colony. Tanzit's leading them. We got Brago and One Eye and Lurker with them. And so it's been like kind of a nice like push and pull. But for me, um, there's so much good stuff in the original series. And to be honest, I think there's a lot of cool stuff to draw from in the 81 revival as well. I know that it gets a bad rap, but and so for me, I haven't had a beat where I'm like, oh, I have to invent a brand new villain. Because there's so much good continuity to work with and so much cool stuff to like just put a new fresh coat of paint on, throw in a little wrinkle, a little twist. That yes, I could write another year's worth if I wanted to, and slot it all in, and I don't think I'd run out of villains. So it's a real gift to work in a series like this. It's all the fun of a superhero title with none of the structural obstacles. And I say that is just like when you're working at a place like Marvel or DC, it's a shared universe, and that doesn't just mean for you as a reader. It's for me as a creator. I got to share the toys. I got to get a sense of like who's using this villain. And I don't know that. My editors know that, and they kind of steer me around. They know where all the bodies are buried. Um, and also just like playing fair and nice with the rest of the publishing line. Sometimes somebody else is beating you to the punch, and you just can't deal with that. You got to work around it. I don't have to do that with Space Ghost. I don't have to share a single toy. I can say I want to play with Zorak, and I'm told, sure, what do you want to do? And I sort of I've given Dynamite and Warner Brothers a huge pitch. My pitch document was 35 pages for this series.
Wow.
The only document that was longer was my notes that I took on every episode and every comic, which was 45 pages. So they know where I'm headed for this book, and Dynamite and Warner Brothers has been so enthusiastic. And it's been so wonderful. It really is the best of both worlds. And I know we're never going to please everybody. That's the nature of any licensed comic. Fandom is just never going to be a monolith. There's going to be some people who don't want to see Space Ghost as a superhero. Maybe they don't know the history, or maybe they're very, very attached to Coast to Coast. And I think writing a Coast to Coast comic is a very different thing. And Andy Merrill and I, who developed Coast to Coast and was the voice of Bragg, he and I have discussed this a lot. Where even he is like, if I was writing this comic, I'd do it as an action book. Like the humor of Coast to Coast with the limited real estate of a comics page, it's tough to translate. And frankly, I wouldn't have been the guy to do it if that's what Warner Brothers wanted. There are a lot of other writers that they would have hit up instead. Um, so yeah, I'm just having a blast working on this book, and seeing. I hope that the enthusiasm translates on the page, and I think just based on the response in these last couple of days, I knock on wood, I think it has.
You know, I don't know if this is the best comparison, but for some reason this is the character that popped in my brain when I was reading the first issue.
Yeah,
Um, Spawn. The reason I was thinking about Spawn is that it's obviously the audience here, and the ones who are telling this through the eyes of the stories being told is Jan and Jace.
yeah,
Space Ghost is this character that kind of appears, and it's his reactions to the characters around him that we understand who he is. So I kind of felt almost like I think it might have been the Spawn, like the cartoon where Spawn's always like in the shadows somewhere, and every character is responding and commenting on it, but he's not necessarily at the forefront. That's where I was
that's
popping in my
cool.
brain.
That's a cool way of thinking about it. And I can see exactly. I thank you for showing your mouth because I totally understand where you're coming from with that. And yeah, I think for me, particularly our first issue, and granted, the cool thing about the way we're doing this series with all these done in ones, that most issues are going to have a fairly different flavor to them. Not wildly different, but just again, that's the appeal of Space Ghost to me, is he's a character who can really organically cover a lot of range, a variety of different influences and inspirations and genres. And so for me, I don't get bored. I could say, oh, I feel like doing a heist issue. So I wrote a heist issue. And I'm like, this could be like a fun sort of like more horror tinge two-parter. Great, Zorak, you're done. Or I want something that's like a bigger, more bombastic, kind of like superhero slugfest. And so I'm very excited to be writing Metalis in a few months, like things like
Hmm.
that. But yeah, I can see exactly where you're coming from. And I'll tell you, for our first issue, we some of the influences, of course, Batman. I think like it trying to extricate Space Ghost from that DNA, I think is a sucker's game. Because it's honest, like that's where it came from.
Yeah.
But I know when I talked with Jonathan Lau, actually a big inspiration for our first issue was Mortal Hulk, issue
Okay.
one. Where if you read that issue,
I
you're
have.
sort of
Finally, yeah.
you don't see Hulk until the end. It's sort of he's a looming presence, but you never see him. It's sort of just like an oppressive shadow that's looming over this poor dude who's like who's running away from a gas station robbery gone wrong. And that was something I wanted to kind of focus on, was rather than having it be from the perspective of a victim of space ghosts, because I don't like that idea, like that, like he may be like a brooding figure of the cosmos, but I think he's ultimately a good man. He's a man who, by virtue of his name and concept, he's playing at being a monster, but he's got a real sensitive core of humanity that's been like pushed way, way down. And having Jan and Jace in his orbit sort of is going to have to force him to reckon with all that. So for me, I thought what was really important was to, this book is Jan and Jace's book just as much as Space Ghost. They're Babs Gordon and Dick Grayson meets Lex and Tim from Jurassic Park. And so I guess Space Ghost might be Batman by way of Alan Grant. And so seeing this world through their eyes, that we're jumping readers into the thick of it, and guess what? Jan and Jace are right in the thick of it too. And that's what I thought was like, yeah, if you see Space Ghost in the shadows, it doesn't matter if he's beating up a bunch of pirates. Like that's a scary guy. You are going to run. You are going to head in the opposite direction. And that's like a fun, dramatically ironic place for them to start, is that these kids who are going to become not just his trusted sidekicks, but like really his reason to live by the end of this series. Uh, when they first meet him, they're like, no. And to be honest, when Space Ghost takes them in, there's going to be a lot of friction. He's great at fighting pirates. Dealing with children, that's way over his head. I've written Space Ghost. I see him as the ultimate single dad. And that is, I think, where a lot of the most fun friction of the book, and the hardest emotional beats come from, is Space Ghost learning that when you have kids, it's like your heart's running around on the outside.
Mm.
And at first, he's not a fan of that. But he realizes that, like, if he wants these kids to survive, he has to train them to defend themselves. And that's when they start working with him in the field, and trying to find answers for what happened to their own planet and their own family. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think seeing your Spawn thing, it does make sense in the context of this first issue. But as the series progresses, like, we are going to see Space Ghost sort of playing off Jan and Jace, in some really fun ways. Space Ghost usually being the straight man, but every so often he's got like just like this razor sharp zinger, usually at the kid's expense. And yeah, it's just a really fun dynamic that shows what a complicated and complex character Space Ghost is. He's scary to pirates, but he's protective of children. And yet at the same time, he's also very begrudging about it because, he had a life. He was a bachelor. He did things in a certain way. And now these kids, as precocious as they are, like, they are not going to fall into line because they're children. And he's going to have to adjust to that. And meanwhile, they're also going to have to kind of learn and grow from this. And sometimes there's going to be some steps back and they're going to have to lick their wounds. But that's ultimately the joy of writing a found family, and the way that we're doing it and the way that we're structuring it is, it's always about the redemptive climb. So, we're going to start off seeing these heroes kind of in their most dire situations. And every so often we will kick them back into that pit. But together, they're always going to climb out. And that's, I think, the hallmark of my favorite parts of writing any kind of series.
Now, that's interesting too with Jan and Jace and Blip.
Yeah.
Um, how to create a character like Space Ghost, but someone who would still have sidekicks who are children, how do you
Mhm.
make that work logically? Because I know there's always
Sure.
that question about Batman and Robin. We're just like, Robin's 10. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know if he's gonna go out with Robin to fight the Joker right now.
Yes. Well, honestly, our first two issues really dig into that, in a big way, because the first question I asked myself, besides how do Space Ghost's powers work, because that was something that took me about a week to kind of like wrap my head around, figuring out how the power bands in particular work. Because in the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons, he had a million powers. Anytime he was in a situation, like, he'd throw out like a heretofore undiscovered power, that gets him out of the thick of things. Um, but beyond that question, the first question I had in my head was, why doesn't he just drop these kids off at the local police station? And without spoiling too much, I think we answer that in issue one. Of just like, there's a lot of corruption in the universe, and I think Space Ghost realizes, like, the safest place is with him. And then I think, as far as what makes them his sidekicks, state you'll have to read issue two to find out. But issue two, I think, is like a just as important as issue one, in that we kind of see their relationship and dynamic keep ratcheting up from issue to issue to issue. But Space Ghost kind of figuring out, like, okay, I can't just let these kids languish at Ghost Planet. They're gonna get into trouble, and I would rather teach them how to defend themselves than, you know, than potentially have them, like, wander off into harm's way. And that's a little double-edged, because it's one of those things that, yeah, Space Ghost, like, you are teaching them to defend themselves, but you are also doing that by putting them in harm's way. And that is something that probably will be discussed, by the time that the series is over. So yeah, I think, it's been a really fun push and pull, and I think in a lot of ways, by not feeling obligated to just figuring out how to reinvent the wheel conceptually, to be able to really lean into the character of it all.
Mm.
And any reinvention is about the character themselves rather than what kind of high concept adventure they're going to be in. It feels really nicely calibrated in that, like, this is a character driven superhero book. And I think, if anything, that might be the biggest hurdle that a book like ours might have, is that I think that does cut against the grain of today's market, where today's market, I think, does lean so heavily into the high concept of it all. And I've done that too. I mean, I write all sorts of high concept stuff. And I think Space Ghost, though, is refreshing to me because it's so driven in character, and it's all about what's this take on Space Ghost, what's this take on Jan and Jason Blip, what's this take on each of these iconic villains that you've gotten a sense of who they are over the course of 60 years just based on Alex Toth's design, but there was never any character development. And that's what we get to really dive into. And yeah, it's a little counter programming in a way, but seeing the way that people have responded to it and are like, oh, I didn't know this character, and now I kind of get a sense of that, of who they are, and I really like that. I want to know more about them. I couldn't have asked for a better response. And so, and yeah, we're gonna give that to you. By the time you finish this series, I hope you're even half as in love with these characters as I am.
Well, the one thing about Space Ghost, I will, and I to admit, like I said, I knew the name, I knew the look, and I knew of the show. I wasn't familiar with him as a character. Now, having done a little bit of research after buying the first issue, there's a lot of different aliases that he's had over the years, and who he was, and bit different stories about who he really is. So, is there one particular one you're going to hold on to? Is there going to be how much backstory are you going to get into his character
Yeah.
and where he came from?
No, it's a good question. And what I'll say is it's brand new continuity. And that was for a variety of reasons, both pragmatic and ethical and legal. In that I didn't want anybody to feel like they had to do homework to do our series, to get into our series. I don't want you to feel you don't have to read anything. In fact, like you don't like I'm not telling you to read a thing. All you need to do is pick up issue 1 to understand our book. I wanted to write it for newcomers just as much as diehard fans. And also, DC in particular, they had 2 different backstories for the character. So I was kind of like, all right, they've already done 2 different ones. I'm just gonna do my own thing. But I'm also not gonna belabor the point too much of like Space Ghost origin. By the end of by issue 2, you'll know just about as much as you need to. In that he's the sole survivor of his planet that was attacked by space pirates, and now it's planet Vector has ever since been referred to as the Ghost Planet, and it's like a spaceship graveyard that Space Ghost has sort of just hollowed out and turned into his base as living this lonely life of like fighting pirates by himself. You don't really need to know too much more than that, honestly. We will have a few breadcrumbs in there. There is definitely going to be a storyline a little later on that's going to kind of what it'll go a little full circle as far as Space Ghost and how he became who he is, and sort of the person behind all of that. Space Ghost is going to have to confront them in a big way, and I'm so excited to get to write that storyline. But yeah, honestly, like it didn't feel right to try to crib from another publisher's continuity. I'm not sure if I could have even done it legally if I had asked. So I just didn't do it. It's very much, it's all new. Like I said, Ultimate Space Ghost is kind of like the vibe that I'm going for with this, and that like of these characters, like Brack is a Space Ghost villain. That's all you need to know. Like we'll fill in the blanks for you. And the same thing with his origin, and the same thing with Jan and Jace. Just because, yeah, like that was half the fun, was just being like, okay, I see all these various pieces in this universe, and how can I kind of stack them in a way that feels coherent and organic, and at the same time kind of like guides the readers through everything in like a logical way. And yeah, I think the way that the things that we've got planned, I think we kind of nailed that.
Well, I think another thing that you do with the first issue I was really impressed with,
You.
that because you're dealing with space and space ghosts and this obviously science fiction, otherworldly kind of thing,
Sure.
that there's when these stories are written, there's a tendency to do exposition dumps. So like,
Sure.
oh, here's paragraphs and paragraphs of things, but you manage to give a lot of information without doing the exposition dumps. So how are you plotting it so you could say what we needed to know, what we needed to know as a reader, but without doing okay, so paragraph 1, let's go into all the details
Yeah.
of the whole thing.
Well, I think for me, and this is something I continue to work on, is I'm always trying to write as tight as I can. and there are certain books that it's harder to do than others. I mean, like Savage Avengers, for example, like the omniscient narrator was like part of that book, and so um we had to use him. Like people would have been really mad if we didn't. They would have said, "This doesn't feel like Savage Avengers. Where's Conan? Where's the omniscient narrator?" And so Space Ghost, though, I don't have to do that. And so I think it's a little different when you have something with captions versus something that doesn't. I think that's like a core decision that you have to make when you're starting any series. And unless you have like a significant runway that you might be able to like, throw in an issue with like captions in one issue, like in a way that makes sense. It's hard to do.
Hmm.
Space Ghost, we're not doing that. And so it's about like, what can you show in dialogue? What can you show visually in action? And so, yeah, I think you just kind of write within your means in that sense. In that if there's something that needs to be explained, character better explain it. And if it's something a character can't explain, then you better try to jettison that as much as possible. Because yeah, you don't have all those captions to be like, oh, well, like, like this, that, and the other thing. But also like sometimes it's like having a little fun with it. We have a little bit in issue two. We have a little conversation with Space Ghost, where we sort of in our tongue-in-cheek way, very, very, very quickly explain how his power bands work.
Hmm.
But in like when you read it, I was really happy with how it turned out. Where like nobody's gonna ask how the power bands work after issue two. We explain it, we move on, we're not going back. And I do think that's some of it as well, is just kind of like trusting your readers to just be like, look, I explained it right here, and if hopefully you remember it, and if not, well, you do have that issue to go back to. But yeah, I think beyond that, it's just yeah, when you're writing with dialogue only, you really you kind of the story morphs to what you can say in dialogue, and
Hmm.
what you show visually, and so you try not to like overextend yourself. You try not to go too crazy high concept. I think when you do have captions, you're able to maybe go a little bit more in that direction. Um, because yeah, then you can have a narrator saying X, Y, Z. But yeah, I think beyond that, yeah, Space Ghost we're trying to write as kind of as lean and tight as possible. And trying to
I just thought how I was just extremely impressed because I just finished launching the second issue of a sci-fi comic book that I wrote. That
yeah,
also, I'm not doing it for Dynamite. It's a much more level. But because it's in the future, I did some exhibition dumping to try to explain things, and I hate exhibition dumps. But I was like, I can't think of another way of doing it. Now I'm reading Space Guns, going, I figured out a lot of what's here without really, like at the end, I was like, ah, that's why that was in that dialogue. But like reading it, it didn't feel like you're being spoon-fed information, just kind of like in the story. Then at the end, you're like, okay, I got it. And then you kind of figure it could kind of like backtrack how you got that information. But it was very impressive how subtle that felt we
thank you.
put to the story.
Thank you. I think sometimes it's just leaning into I think when you have to do some exposition, trying to kind of coat it with a little bit of humor, I think helps. In the case of Blip, for example, I'm so happy I can finally talk about this now that like it's out. Blip is kind of the linchpin of our whole story. He's the binary language integrated prototype. And when I wrote that, I patted myself on the back a little bit. I was like, oh, so clever. And then I realized like, oh, I have to introduce that in an actual thing, and it sounds so dumb. So I figured, let's have Jace. Like Jace just like spills the beans. Like he's just like he's such a like a peppy but kind of naive kid that like these two obviously corrupt cops show up and are like, why do you think your base got attacked? And Jan like reads the room. It's like, I don't know. And Jace is like, oh well, let me explain everything to you, officers. And Jace is a fun character in that regard, where he does like he often like there are certain beats that like allow me to like explain things a little bit, just because like Jace is both like a motor mouth, but he's also a tech guy. So he's just like, let me explain it. Like, I think I know how your power bands work. Can I explain them to you? And Space Ghost is like, I know how my power bands work. I built them. Like it's a lot of fun. I will say we have an issue coming up a little down the line. I don't think it's the next one I'm writing. I think it's the one after that. Where we've got a little bit of exposition, like scientific stuff, and the way that we're going to explain it is so funny to me. I can't wait for people to read that issue. I hope if we pull it off the way that I'm hoping, it's going to be like my favorite issue of the entire run. But yes, it's so yeah, it's just, you when you have to lean into it, do it with humor, and if not, just like try to keep it as lean as you can. I guess it's the best advice I've got. But you really, it's all about feeling it out. It's hard to prescribe anything without it. It's very situational. It's really case by case. You're just kind of trying to feel it out as you're writing it.
Well, like I said, I was just extremely impressed by it. Like I said, I know what I was doing, the struggle I had to try to get the information out there so I could just get on with my issue.
Yeah.
But I liked what you were doing. I was like, oh, that's so much smarter than me. But but like I said,
Yeah.
the first issue is really good.
Thank you.
And like on the line, I had you had a lot of praise from Gail Simone, which is a huge compliment to have Gail Simone
Yeah.
giving you the thumbs up
Gail's
on what you're doing.
Gail is such a wonderful person. I can't say enough good things about her. Gail was I met her at Boston Comic Con a few years back. I had just come out with my second or my third book, Going to the Chapel. And we were tabling right next to each other at Boston Comic Con. And so I gave her a copy of my book. And then I think it was around Savage Avengers, I reached out to her again just to be like, hey, like I just started at Marvel and I really look up to you. Could I send you a copy of it? And she was so nice about that. And then yeah, around when Space Ghost came out, I knew that she was a big fan of the character of Space Ghost. And so I reached out to her and I was just like, hey, I know you're a big fan of Space Ghost. I know you're doing a million things right now because you are doing X-Men and Action Comics and Lord knows how many other high profile books. But you're a Space Ghost fan, and I would love to hear what you think. And no one was more surprised than me Wednesday when Gail just like blows up Twitter talking about how much she liked Space Ghost. But she is just a lovely person for somebody who is as high profile and established as she is, for someone to be as gracious for writers who are up and coming like me.
Mm.
It means the world, because it's so easy. I think when you're a big name, you're busy. It's not even like a matter of like picking up the ladder behind you. It's just you're just trying to keep your head above water. You're doing all these big high profile things and living your own life. To have a creator like Gail really championing people who are on their way up, it's a very gracious thing to do. It's really stand up of her. Like I didn't think I could think any more highly of her last week. And this week I even more so. I'm just so grateful to her, and yeah, we're just trying to live up to it. But yeah, seeing that how she understood kind of what we were going for with this book, yeah, it gives me a lot of hope that a lot of other readers will too.
Well, I was gonna say a good shout out to Boston Comic Con. I just got my press pass today for this year's Boston Comic Con, so I'm gonna be there.
Oh,
So it's
nice.
exciting to talk about it. So yes, thank you, Boston Fan Expo.
Yeah, it's a great show, and I live in the West Coast, so it's been a minute since I've been able to go back.
Hmm.
But it's a lovely show. The fans are fantastic. Really just a stellar crowd that loves comics. So, yeah, anybody going to Boston Comic Con, have so much fun for me. I'm probably not going to be able to go this year or the next because I'm getting married this year, and
Oh,
my sister's
congratulations.
next year. But yes, thank you. So yes, but I do want to go back because it's such a great crowd and such a great show.
So, what can our listeners look forward to in the upcoming issues of Space Ghost?
Boy, yeah, well, a lot of action, a lot of humor, a lot of heart, a lot of emotional moments. Yes, I'm writing one of Space Ghost's arch nemesis right now. So wait until you see what we got planned for Zorak. That's going to be a very fun series. Or a very fun storyline. That's going to have some fallout for our characters after that. But yeah, we're gonna, like I said, these are all primarily done in one stories. Anytime we do a rare two-parter, it means it's like Space Ghost against his like most dangerous enemies. Like he's really in it. If it's a two-parter, and so, but that's by design that we wanted to do these done in one stories, is that readers who don't know who Space Ghost is, um, they can kind of rack up adventures with him very, very quickly. And I think by racking up, seeing Space Ghost operating through like 10 different adventures or, a dozen different adventures, you get to know him a little bit better, and you get to be like, I hope, feel a little more invested versus like if I did just like a 5 issue arc, where it's just one story broken up in 5 parts. And so, yeah, a lot of villains. You're gonna see, you've already seen Brack and Sisto. You're gonna see Zorak and Metalis and Creature King and the Widow and Moltar. You're gonna see the Council of Doom. You're gonna see a few other deeper cuts that you might not expect. But yeah, lots of fun stuff planned for this series and these characters. But yeah, also, it's an emotional journey. It's a coming of age story, honestly. Like, it's less, it's not Space Ghost year one, but it is kind of Jan and Jace year one.
Mm.
Uh, and seeing the way that they kind of grow and evolve as Space Ghost wards. It's a little bit of a deep cut, but if you ever read the confession arc in Astro City that Kurt Busiek wrote, it's that was a big influence. That Lone Wolf and Cub, like I said, Dr. Grant and Lex and Tim from Jurassic Park. That's kind of the interpersonal vibe that we've got in this. Blip's going to step up in a big way. Stay tuned. We've got a Blip centric issue that I cannot wait to write. It will be my favorite issue of the entire series if we land it the way that I want to land it. And I think it's mine to screw up. Jonathan draws magnificently. I should shout out Jonathan Lau. I've been talking nonstop about these fictional characters and not enough about the man behind the book, which is Jonathan Lau is a superstar artist. I've been such a fan of his since his work on Green Hornet with Kevin Smith. Boy, it was 15 years ago, and he's only gotten better, obviously. I think Jonathan is delivering the work of his career on Space Coast, truly. It is, yeah, he is just absolutely, no pun intended, dynamite. Like he's able to do these big bombastic superhero moments. And just wait, issue 2, there's a sequence that's like he and Andrew Dahlhaus. It's like the most beautiful thing I've ever been a part of. I'm just like, oh my God, like you'll know when you see it in issue 2. But then he's immediately able to switch gears to these like heartfelt moments. Like these just kind of small, quiet, emotional beats. He knows how to draw Jan and Jace as kids. Which is like a Herculean feat in this industry. I mean, there are certainly other books with children where they look like horrifying homunculi, like weirdly shaped adults and not children. Jonathan makes them. He understood the assignment from the jump. That this is an ensemble book. That he does give Space Ghost these cool, powerful moments, but also like this is just as much Jan and Jace's story, and he's not going to shove them away in a corner. He's not going to just like throw them in like in his accessories, in the background somewhere. Like he cares about these characters just as much as I do, and so yeah. To answer your question, if there's anything else to expect, it's Jonathan Lau knocking your socks off because I tell you, every single issue somehow looks more gorgeous than the one that came before it. As he's like learned these characters, boy, it's magnificent. I shared a photo or a picture from issue 3 the other day. It's just like Space Ghost and Jace. And I'm like, oh, my heart, like just seeing them standing together where I'm like, oh, you guys are father and son and you don't know it. That's Jonathan. Jonathan does so much heavy lifting and making you fall in love with these characters. And yeah, I'm so fortunate to be able to work with him. I mean, I feel like I've been very lucky in my career that I've worked with like just nonstop top shelf artists, and Jonathan is the latest. So I'm so grateful to be working with him, and he just yeah, can't say enough good things about him.
Well, like I said, I really think you did a great job with the first issue. I look forward to getting my second issue. Hopefully, it's at the store when I go this time.
Yes, tell your comic shop. Add Space Ghost to your pull list. Because yeah, we want we want Warner Brothers to know that there's a lot of demand for this. Like I said, I pitched this series as 12 issues in an annual because I was asked like, how about a year to start? But I've got a few stories, a few characters in my back pocket that I would love to do something with that like there wasn't enough room for them as sort of the main storyline, but also they were too cool, I thought, to like just leave as cameos. So, I've probably got like, I've got several months backup ideas, in my back pocket. So order the book. Tell Dynamite and Warner Brothers you want these stories because man, I want to write about the Eclipse Woman so bad I could taste it. The Antimatter Man, like let's get him in there. So yes, tell your local comic shop, add Space Ghost to your pull list because this book is the adventure of a lifetime, and I can't wait for you to see what's coming next.
Well, I definitely will. David, it was an absolute pleasure talking with you, sir. Thank you so much for coming back and talking Space Ghost.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great night, sir.
You too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Divergent Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Sure to turn for the next episode when Dan Waters boards the mothership to discuss Destro from Image Comics. Till next voyage, travel on.